good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me at this session. I feel really privileged to be in this company of fellow educators who are committed to sustaining student-centric education in higher education. But I will confess to feeling also rather apprehensive. You all know now, after Carmel's session yesterday, that I'm the last remaining dinosaur who's still roaming the earth without a mobile. So that makes me into a digital immigrant from a prehistoric age, and I'm treading on very alien turf of the digital native. So I can't claim to be an expert, but I am a teacher, and in the almost 40 years that I've spent at NUS, I have given more than passing thought to my teaching, to my students, and to their learning. And although, as I warned you in my abstract, I haven't got all the answers, I have continued to search for them. Okay. Perhaps more so, increasingly more so, because as Vice Provost reminded us in his special message, more than ever than before, as educators, we must reflect on the questions of active and creative student engagement and how we may add value to students' learning both inside and outside of the classroom. And indeed, as he also mentioned just now, educating this generation is a tremendous challenge, right? Not the least of which is trying to get to know them. So, who are the Gen Ys? And Merry Christmas, by the way. They have many aliases, and there have been many attempts to define them. And I just heard from Matthew that they also call the strawberry generation because they bruise easily. That's a new one to me, but as you can see, there are many, many of these monikers that they go by. And it doesn't help that their dates of birth and dates of termination are confusingly variable. Now, this is a quiz that the Pew Research Center used to survey some 50 million students between the age of 18 and 29. And if you look at it, and if your answers are this, then you are Gen Y. I must say, though, that I took the quiz too, and I got most of the answers except for the mobile, the pierced ear, the piercings, and the tattoo. And you can tell that I wasn't born after 1977. So I suspect that the quiz is not absolutely definitive, and that the label Gen Y is, like all labels, a label of convenience, right? And we really are dealing here perhaps with a certain degree of stereotyping. So I thought, as you can see, I'd go back to source and try defining Gen Y. Okay. Now, Howe and Strauss were the granddaddies who might be the ones who popularized this notion of Gen Y, defined these characteristics, identified these characteristics in Gen Y. They are special, they are confident, they've had a sheltered existence because they have helicopter parents who hover above them, taking care of all their needs. They're pressured, they're conventional, they're team-oriented, and they are achieving, right? And there have been other studies which sees them as optimistic, intelligent, ambitious, they're multitaskers, they're interested in learning, they're active learners, they value flexibility, they require prompt and frequent feedback, they're tech-savvy, and they're connected. But there are also some negative traits, as other researchers have discovered. They are narcissistic, they are what in China is called the cool generation, right? the Generation Me. They have a sense of entitlement, they're dependent and needy, they have a low sense of agency, they have poor time management skills, they lack curiosity, they're easily bored, they're impatient, they demand instant gratification, they're deficient in critical thinking, they're unmotivated, academically unengaged, and they have poor long-term planning skills. They are also ethically challenged and ill-mannered. Now, those of you who are Singaporeans will recognize this picture, which was sent to the newspaper. Here are youngsters sitting in seats which are intended for the handicapped and the elderly. You will probably also remember seeing this picture, where you have one of our able-bodied national servicemen having his backpack carried by his maid. Okay? But are the cohort effects really that significant? This is another picture that someone sent to the press as well. Looks like it's not just the Gen Yers who have their maids carry their bags. Now, guess who said this? Anybody got the answer? It could be you, it could be me, right? We quite often say, you know, in my time, we were much better behaved and so on. So you might be surprised that it's actually attributed to Plato in the 5th century BC, which seems to suggest that, you know, people don't change that much. Yeah? Children aren't that different. So I would suggest that perhaps Gen Y is a bit of a generalization, and is a generalization of possibly questionable reliability and validity. The sampling, for instance, is largely of the non-probability nature, and is derived from convenience sampling. You know, someone has a class and they take it from their students who are taking that class, or it's taken from student preferences, student satisfaction surveys, and so on. And of course, things like the Pew study, they're based on a North American student population. So how much applicability would be a question that's subject to debate. There are also some rather challengeable I forgot the last point, which is, you know, yes, all these things that we've been talking about, the Gen Y, how much do they actually relate to teaching? Right? It might describe them as people in terms of their behavior, but how much of it has a bearing upon the way they behave as learners? And as I said, there's some challengeable distinction. They're said to be deficient in critical thinking skills, but is that a cohort effect? Might it have something to do with other factors like the way we teach, the way we examine them? Right? Grade inflation, has that got something to do with it as well? Now, they seem to be rather demanding, but is it because, you know, these days it's so easy to send an email, and students expect you to reply very promptly? That, incidentally, is one reason, the main reason, why I don't carry a mobile. I don't want to be on call 24/7. I feel like a prisoner that's tagged. So is it just because of availability of access? And is multitasking necessarily high performance? Or is it just task switching, right? Which actually results in capacity interference, impaired performance, and what to me is perhaps more pernicious, students now developing the inability to focus because they're, you know, rapidly moving from point to point. Now, some of these claims that's been made for Gen Y are also, I think, somewhat dubious because they're not exactly evidence-based. I would think that they're much more like opinions and perceptions and biases, you know, confirmation bias, availability bias, and maybe just a basic, simple thing of normative personality changes. As we grow older, as a dean of education research at NIE said in an interview that he had with the press just a couple of weeks ago, we forget how rebellious we were when we were young. And when we grow older, we feel we have better values and think that the younger generation is deteriorating, but it's only really a perception, right? We keep talking about the good old age, the good old times, but perhaps we are remembering, or we are thinking or seeing the good old age through rather rosy-tinted glasses. So is Gen Y really a different breed Well, here's two views. They're not significantly busier, more confident, or more positive than they were in recent decades. And analysis of research data suggests that these students may not be as different from other generations in the fundamental process of learning, which is my point. That yes, in terms of their behavior, they may be a little different, but in terms of their behavior as learners, perhaps there isn't that much that's very different. So that being so, I would suggest that it might not be a good idea to be overly driven by concerns with catering to the stereotype. Certainly, I wouldn't think it necessary to accommodate some of their allegedly negative attributes like being bored easily or their sense of entitlement, for instance. Right? And I would suggest instead that it would be more useful to return to fundamentals, to focus our attention on the kind of things that might have a more meaningful impact, not just on a single generation, but perhaps serving a broader spectrum of students. So fundamental questions like, what do my students need to learn? What do I want them to learn? Okay? And how may I best help them to learn? Well, NUS envisions graduates who are quick, well-rounded, with well-rounded minds, well-equipped to succeed in a fast-changing world. Now, for me, well-equipped translates into being learning-enabled and being lifelong capable. In other words, they've learned how to learn, they've developed a desire to learn, and that will sustain them in lifelong learning. Clearly, we need to help equip our students with competencies for life, as the Vice Provost has pointed out. So what are some of these competencies? Not exclusive, I think, to Gen Y, yeah? Except maybe the last point about multiple literacies. Okay? And what about competencies for the workplace? Well, we all know that the 21st century is very fast-moving. Right? Yes, in that regard, it is true that Gen Y lives at a different pace and at a different age. But what do employers want? Employers actually want only 18th century skills. Right? Skills in specific fields. Right? So if you are trained for a specific profession, those are the skills that employers do look for. But they also want a broad range of skills and knowledge, right? So the association, the American Association for Colleges and Universities, did a survey in 2010. They interviewed some 300 employers, and these were what they ranked as important. Top of the list, ability to communicate orally and in writing, 89%. Critical thinking and reasoning, the ability to apply knowledge and skills to real-world settings, ability to analyze and solve complex problems, and to connect choices, actions to ethical decisions. So more than 3/4 of the employers thought these were important. And if you look down this list, more than 2/3 thought there were these other additional things: teamwork, ability to innovate, knowledge of concepts, developments in science and technologies, which are also seen as important by more than 2/3 of the employers. Now, these indications from employers weren't very different from what employers were telling universities 20 years ago. Right? These are, I think, core skills. Wouldn't you agree? That would be useful in 50 years ago, I mean, for that matter, any age. Now, there are other employer surveys done in the UK, and if you look at the core requirements, this thing is not working, yeah. Again, you see the same repeat offenders, as it were. Okay. And if you look at Singapore employers, this is a study done by the Association for Chartered and Certified Accountants, which explains why it's a little less imaginative and less comprehensive than the other ones. But 90% of employers rate applicable skills and job knowledge. So they're much more focused in their ability to serve in the workplace. Okay, so on the basis of that, and I then went on to look at how we might enable our learners to become better learners. What sort of strategies that are pedagogically sound might we use to help them become better learners, to help their learning become more meaningful, rather than just more fun, more convenient? Because I firmly believe that the responsibility of the teacher is to enable our learners to become better learners. I don't see myself as delivering customer satisfaction. I don't see students as customers, and that we need to pander to their every need. Perhaps you might disagree with that, and we can talk about that later on. But I'm much more concerned about, okay, how do we enable them to become better learners? Okay. So again, I went back to the granddaddy, Chickering and Gamson, more than 3 decades ago, identified 7 principles. Okay, these 7 principles, and I'm sure you're all familiar with them. What I did was to run these by my students that I taught this year. And this is how they ranked them, which is interesting because they had contact between student and faculty as their top of the list. Somebody asked at Carmel's session yesterday, will the teacher become redundant? And I think Carmel says, no, they never become redundant because, teaching is a distinctly human activity. Yeah? So students have indicated they actually want more contact between themselves and the faculty, and not necessarily virtual contact. They want to see us in the flesh. Right? They want timely feedback, and they want active learning. And the other things, well, yes, they've ranked it the other way. Now, some time ago, at CDTL, we did a longitudinal study, a fairly large-scale longitudinal study, and we validated it with some focus group discussions. And these were the findings. Right? Students told us what helped them in their learning and what hindered them in their learning. And based on this and the findings of others, I have simplified the list to 3 I's, or imperatives. I think what it is, if you boil it all down, really what's going to influence the way our students learn would be incentives, interest, and interaction. To me, those are the 3 key things. You may or may not agree, but motivation obviously is very important, and that point's been made yesterday as well, and both intrinsic as well as extrinsic motivation. Interest, again, intrinsic as well as extrinsic. And particularly in the 21st century, when we are such a connected world, interaction, active learning, experiential learning, that's going to be playing a very major role. So I then asked myself the question, what will enhance incentive, interest, and interaction, and at the same time appeal to Gen Y? Now, in the Pew study, Gen Y cited the use of technology as the single most important attribute that differentiated them as a generation. And as Prof. Tan also said, these are people who were born with technology. The minute they were delivered, technology was already there. So obviously technology is a very important part of their life. These are people who not only embrace technology, they actually sleep with their cell phones. I can't imagine why, because I can think of many more interesting sleeping partners. But clearly, they are the connected generation, right? How many of these do you recognize? They are into social networking in a really big way. I have to confess I don't recognize too many of these. Okay. But perhaps for the younger generation, yes, these are things that are very familiar to them. The US teens between the age of 12 and 17, as reported in Teens and Technology, actually have very high usage, okay? And they spend many hours in social networks. And in about 2 years, Facebook actually reached an audience of more than 15 million. So that tells us something, I suppose, about how important technology is to this age. And then when I looked at what Singaporean youths were doing, and again you see that it's those between the age of, say, 15 to 34 that has the highest usage. Of course, Generation Z will have even higher usage, okay? But these have very high usage as well. And more of our teens' usage. Okay. So obviously, technology is going to feature very importantly, or needs to feature very importantly in our teaching. So not so much teaching and learning as teching and learning. Yeah. How best can we deploy ICT for teaching and learning? What are some of its strengths? There are many, and I will admit I'm not the best person to talk about ICT because, as you know, I'm a dinosaur. But even a dinosaur can recognize that there are these distinct advantages that the technology provided by Web 2.0, for instance, can provide. It makes learning a lot more individualized, customized, personalized. It provides an immersive environment so students can be learning anytime, any place, all the time if they wish, in and out of the classroom. It's highly interactive, it's multimodal, and it's just in time. Right? It provides learning just in time. Now I've got a few of these charts because I won't leave on for too long, but if you just want to scan through it, and if any of you are interested, I'd be very happy to send you my slides. But these are the details, so I won't bore you with them. Although I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get the slides to fit into, the thing to fit into the slides. You know how we fidget with our slides, yeah. Okay, immersive, it provides a real-world experience and scenarios. It's pervasive, interactive. It's good for information gathering and sharing, ideas and thought sharing. It's collaborative learning and problem solving. And perhaps most important, it's not just about them getting information, it's about them generating information. So learners become participants, yeah? And there is then that collective knowledge, the collective intelligence that we're hearing so much about. And it also enables feedback that is prompt, timely, dynamic. It's multimodal, and I hardly need to belabor this point. I think we all now know that people learn in different ways, and the more approaches you offer them, more means of accessing information that you offer them, the more likely you're able to cater to a larger audience. And then there's just-in-time learning. We are an age that's deluged by information. We talk about information glut, yeah, information overload. I was astonished to learn that some 30, or maybe not so astonished, 31 million searches on Google every month. And it made me wonder, where were our students getting their information before Google? Now, of course, Google is not only used by our students. I use it too all the time. But you know, there's a lot of information out there, and students are now obviously having an alternate source to getting their information. And for them, it is a matter of, what do I need to know now, and how quickly can I get hold of the information? And they can do it now quite easily. Okay, so as I say, these are the details which I won't belabor. I want to move on to talk about the reality of teaching digital natives. because I think that's, to me, a much more interesting question. Does the use of technology necessarily translate into the use of technology for learning, which is what we as educators are interested in? Yeah? If you look here, you'll find that, for those Generation Z, yes, but this round, not that high for the blue band for education or learning activities, okay, which tells us something. And I think Carmel's studies also showed that, well, yes, students think it's a good idea, but they're not actually using it all that much. They would use it, yes, but if we lived in a perfect world or something like that. So, use of technology, yes, well, they are perfect, always connected, but are they using it for learning? And is familiarity with digital devices necessarily also knowing how to use technology for learning? Is being tech savvy, does that mean that they have an enhanced ability to learn? Well, the jury is still out whether there's actually some physiological change to the brains of Gen Y, people who are always using technology. Does that somehow change their neural pathways and make them into more high-performing learners? But as I say, there's no conclusive evidence as such. But more important is the ability to access information, even if they're accessing information for learning. Does that mean they actually understand and know how to use that information responsibly? Okay. Now, I would suggest that our students really need training, and I use the word training in inverted commas. Oops. They need training in using ICT for learning. They need training in information and media literacy. And, a special bugbear of mine, they need training in integrity, academic integrity and ethics. Now, I wonder how many of your students know how to do these tasks? Prof Tan mentioned that we had e-learning week. Yeah? We had it in the FASS a couple of years ago, I think, yes. And that's when I discovered that our students are not that tech savvy. Maybe it's because I come from the arts half of the campus, and we are a little suspicious of technology in that part of. My students may not be, they hold cell phones, yes, but they are still, I think, a little slower to take up technology than their science peers on the other side of the ridge. So I found that actually many of them weren't familiar with how to do these, even to me, relatively simple tasks. More important, information and media literacy. I think we need to teach students, not only through media, but also about media, to raise their awareness about text, context, subtext, their awareness about media as representation with its own language, with its own codes, with its own conventions, and, more important, awareness of media as not ideologically and value-free. Our students tend to take as gospel faith, whatever is on the internet must be right. I think that's something that we need to change them, educate them in, to make them into more critical readers, to be able to analyze and evaluate information. We also need, I think, to educate them in the code of conduct. And not so long ago, there was something in the papers about the need for reminding youth, right, that there are certain rules that need to be observed, like, for instance, not posting racist comments online. Yeah? So these are things, I think, some basic things to me, that our students need to be made more aware of. Integrity. I suspect that intellectual honesty is an issue that will resonate with many of us here in the audience. Yeah? This is the latest report from Turnitin. And Turnitin says, we live in a digital culture where norms around copying, reuse, sharing are colliding with core principles of academic integrity. And again, in teens and technology, it was reported that 55% of those between the age of 12 and 17 do not see an issue about, copying, or they don't really worry about copyrighted materials, whatever they download. So if you look at this, it's a little disconcerting. We actually have 128 million content matches. And this is in Turnitin. Hello. How many of you use Turnitin, by the way? Yeah, okay. Now, I actually find it quite surprising that although I tell my students, I will be asking you to submit your essays to Turnitin. So I will know. I don't even have to make a lot of effort. I will know if you've plagiarized. And in spite of that, every semester I have to deal with students who plagiarize. And then when I ask them, but why did you do it? I would catch you. And I warned you, don't do it, because if you do it, I have to do very nasty things to you. They said, well, I forgot. I didn't intend to. And, these same excuses keep coming up. So I really think that we need to actively teach academic integrity. Now, in the university, we do have policies. We have institutional policies that are clearly spelled out. But maybe what we need to do while we're teaching is continuously reinforce the importance of intellectual honesty. We also need to encourage students to be responsible for academic integrity. And I think we need to respond firmly when there is a breach. Very often we sort of buckle at the knee when we think, well, this will mean that they'll fail the module. But we need to be a little bit more strong-minded about that. Okay, now back to the question, does the use of ICT enhance learning? Yes, according to some studies. But being the spoilsport and skeptic that I am, I can't resist including a cautionary note. How easy it is to lose sight of the key reason for digitization, which is providing your audience with knowledge. Right? This is from the report by the Joint Committee on Information Systems in the UK. Do we really need an application that tells us what's right in front of us? Right? So Kiritika will know. Kiritika, our IT expert at CDTL, when she used to come to me and say, we have a new application, I would say, will it cook my dinner tonight? Will it improve the quality of my life? I have very high demands for what technology can do for me. Because I think teaching and learning is more than just teching. Okay? Ultimately, teaching, as I said earlier on, is a distinctly human activity. And whatever technology we use is designed by a human. Right? So it is informed by human intelligence. And interestingly, even the digital natives actually subscribe to that belief. Again, this is from the JISC report. The traditional methods of teacher-pupil learning, they want personal, face-to-face interaction as the backbone of their learning. Those who are leading-edge users or have high use of ICT or at school are perhaps more technology savvy and open to its use, but they do not want technology to encroach on their learning or social experiences. Fundamentally, this age group suspects that if all learning is mediated through technology, it will diminish the value of their learning. So we have hope for the Gen Y yet. Yeah? They can see that there is value in a more blended form of learning. So I come back to the 3 I's: incentive, interest, and interaction. Incentive. Again, these are sort of lists which if you're interested, I can send to you. I've simply identified some of the strategies that we might use to incentivize our learners. I'll pause so you can read it more quickly than I can say it. An interest. I pause there because in a campus-wide study that we did, we found that students reported as their top positive descriptor for effective teaching. Interesting, right? They see that as the most important thing that defines effective teaching. And that's collocated with, amongst other things, being humorous. Are we simply to be providing entertainment? I know the term edutainment is now fairly current, but I think it's more than that. Teaching is more than that. It's all these other things as well. And finally, to promoting interaction. Again, many of these things I'm sure you are already doing and familiar with. Right? What we need perhaps to be more conscious of, and that's really all I hope to convey, is that we need to be sort of actively, conscientiously, consciously, purposefully adopting more of these strategies so that we can enable our students to learn more interactively. Right? So buzz, brainstorm, debate, role play, simulations, presentations, peer critique, discussion, panel discussions, symposiums, posing questions, using reflective pauses so that students can be interacting with the content, interacting not necessarily just between interaction, not just between students and students and students and the teacher, but also with the content. IBL, PBL sessions and strategies, group project, community-based project, peer teaching, study groups, games, game shows, and so on. Feedback, very important, because that's how a great deal of learning happens. And a conducive learning environment, which includes conducive learning spaces, such as those that Prof. Tan Tai Yong, the other Prof. Tan, spoke about yesterday. At University Town, there is now collaborative commons, active learning rooms, global learning seminar rooms. Right? Here's one, here's another. And here's a room which has mobile furniture, walls that you can write on, and so on. Now, before I degenerate into sounding like a commercial, let me stop here and thank you for your presence. Thank you. If you have comments and questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Hello, my name is Ginny Servant, and I have the privilege of being a digital native. And I just wanted to ask you, don't you feel that with the digital natives, yes, we learn in the same way, but technology gives us infinitely more possibilities than was in the past, and the role of the teacher is not so much to teach, but as to guide us to be tech-capable and, more importantly, tech-wise.
I entirely agree that there are many more possibilities provided by the developments in technology. But I think the point I was trying to make really is the point that Prof. Gui made, which is we don't want to be so focused on the technology and forget about the teaching and learning part of it. So I don't think we are essentially in disagreement. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chris McMorran. I'm here at NUS, Department of Japanese Studies. I have 2 points, and you can choose which one to comment on. One is, in your talk, there's a lot of, I think, confusion between technology and internet. I mean, there was a time in history when the button was a technology. Yeah. So we have to, I think, parse those a little bit better. Okay. The second point is that much has been made about UTown and the kind of collaborative workspaces that have been created there. And I just taught a class there this last fall. Fall and spring have no meaning here, sorry. The last semester. And I'm wondering when someone is going to evaluate my experience and my students' experience. And we can treat this kind of creation of UTown with its own kind of rubric to judge whether it's really doing what it claims it's doing.
Okay. Both are
Thank
good
you.
points. Both are good points, and I thank you for both of them. The U-Town point, I'm sure Vice Provost will take back to the Provost's office. Yeah. But you do have an end of semester feedback exercise, don't you? All modules are evaluated at the end of semester. So presumably your students will have some sort of comment about their learning experience in this spiffy, posh environment that you're able to operate in.
Is there a question about the space, though? It's a question about the class. I don't
yes.
think there's any question about
There
the
is no,
space.
but there are the open-ended questions where students can comment, I suppose. But you're right, they're not sort of specifically directed to comment on space. But that is an excellent suggestion. I think, I remember at some point the provost mentioning that a great deal of thought and expense has gone into the creation of Newtown. And he encouraged all of us to use it as much as possible because technology being what it is, it will become obsolete very soon. And we don't use it while it's fresh. It would be a waste of the resources that's been pumped in. About your first point, I agree. And that will show that I am the dinosaur and the digital immigrant that I am. I don't actually see a huge difference between the two, between technology and internet. And except that, yes, internet is about connectivity. It's about a much more powerful way of enabling learners to, much more powerful tools that learners can learn with. So when I use the word technology, I'm using it in a sort of very loose sense. Yeah? Thank you.
Since a specific question was asked about the youth now, indeed we are making plans to put in place a fairly comprehensive, hopefully longitudinal study of how effective has been the U-Town the development. It's very important to us. I think one of the, if you remember in the message I talk about, we are beginning to grapple with the issue of effectiveness more than just the input. So for example, just because we have diversity, we have so many different students to us, does that mean our students automatically become globally oriented? And increasingly the answer is no. But we need to have a sense of how to measure that effectiveness. And unfortunately for education, a lot of this takes a lot of planning, and it takes a long time to slowly to be able to piece the result together. But indeed, a fairly major program, and I think CDDL will be quite heavily involved in this program of how we start measuring the effectiveness of a number of the new initiatives we put in NUS. So sorry, just a small point to say that we are thinking about it seriously.
I'd just like to, before I ask or make my comment, that yes, at Chinese U we've also set in a number of studies on new learning spaces, and some of students' responses are surprising, and they're published on our website, so they might be interesting. I want to make a comment and be a bit more controversial. First of all, I don't think we're in any opposition at all. I think I agree with virtually everything you'd say, although I perhaps might be a bit more enthusiastic about embracing some of the tools. But that's I think it's.
I did say I'm a small sport.
Yeah. I don't think that's an issue. I'd like to make a comment, though, about integrity, because it is so important, and I share that concern with you. We have mandatory plagiarism detection at Chinese University, so all the students have to pop their thing through, and yes, they're all quite easy, can do this. Our problem is the teachers, because the similarity report is sent to the teacher, and the teacher then has to decide if that constitutes a case that needs further investigation or not. And that is a judgment. It's not always, a machine is not going to tell you if it's plagiarism, okay? And what we're finding is that some of our teachers do not click on the similarity report. In other words, they don't want to know. So now we're monitoring the teachers, and a few teachers get sent little questions to say, are you having some trouble with accessing the reports? And it is a question, and I think it's because teachers, particularly younger teachers, although some older, but they're not wanting to actually be in a confrontational situation. Sure. So we really, it's all very good for us sort of old tough if I can put it that way, if you don't mind us calling ourselves this way. I'm quite happy to say to someone, this is unethical. Please don't do it. Let's look at what's going on. But if you're younger, less sure, and the issue of evaluations, this is a problem. And so we have to look now for ways to make it a secure environment and a comfortable environment for teachers to carry out what is their responsibility. So it's not sort of as simple as we actually hoped.
Yes, yes, yes. And thank you for making that point. You know, when I have to deal with a student who has plagiarized, it actually creates a lot more work for me. I then have to write a report. We have to arrange for an interview for the student to come and, you know, do this thing before the disciplinary board and so on. So yes, there is a temptation to say, well, forget it, you know, this is marginal or whatever. But this is where, you know, your point really becomes valid, that we need to get people to think of this as crucial, non-negotiable.
Well, we now monitor the teachers.
Yeah.
So it has become non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable, yeah. How do you monitor that?
Well, because we know from the logs whether or not they access the report.
Ah, okay.
And if they don't access the report, that then
Okay, yeah.
goes into the system.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if ours does. I must check with CIT, because our Center for Instructional Technology, they are the people who oversee this.
And we do studies, we do independent studies on the actual similarity reports to see whether or not teachers who do click on the report and who don't constitute, because we were getting high number of high similarity reports from the plagiarism detection, but not a high number of cases
Reporting.
of plagiarism being followed up.
I think perhaps it's best to carry that conversation outside because there are two more people waiting to ask questions. May I have the next question, please?
My name is Chey Hoon. Thanks, Daphne, for the interesting talk. I want to acknowledge one very important thing that you have said this morning about timely feedback. And the students' survey showed that timely feedback is what they want for the Y-Gen. It is very interesting and very rewarding to know that the technology helps us with the feedback, because we can't arrange for a mutual good time to give feedback. So with the technology email, we can do round the clock feedback. So when the student asks questions, we can point to relevant issues, and then they come back to you rather than giving them direct answer. So I think that technology has helped us with feedback. So after a few times when we meet face to face, it becomes old friends. So that feedback from technology is very good. My question is, which is continuing from the previous person, is about how do we use technology to train, to inculcate, to promote about professionalism. We know that integrity is one of them, but how do we continue from there? Because from the survey and all the employers' requests, professionalism and communication skills is so important. Can you help us with that?
Well, I would suggest that, you know, again, this is something that we cannot entrust entirely to the machine, right? Because things like developing values, mentoring, role modeling plays an important part. The teacher demonstrating what is ethical practice is a very powerful way of persuading your students that this is important. Right? It's no good just telling them, oh, okay, that's a tutorial. Go look at it yourself, and you know this is what constitutes. We already have that. We have the statement about plagiarism and what it is that you shouldn't do, and so on. But students don't pay attention unless you actually tell them. And then they actually see it in effect, demonstrate it by you in your dealings with them. So my short answer would be yes, we need to train them by actually explicitly teaching them about it. And I use the word teaching in quite a prescriptive sense. But you know, coming back to your point about the feedback, the feedback's not only good for us to provide to students, but I think the machine can do a lot of things that provide formative feedback. You know, students can now do their own tests, quizzes, drills, and they get instant feedback. And the good thing about the machine, of course, is that it's tireless. They can do it 100 times and the machine will say, don't you ever learn? Whereas I suppose humans might run a little short of patience. Yeah. So yes, in terms of feedback, the machine has done a lot to help us. Yeah.
Thank you, Daphne. May I invite the last question, please? There was someone waiting to ask a question.
I think tea is more important now.
Well, if not, I have the privilege and pleasure of now presenting a book specially authored by our Provost, Professor Tan Tai Yong. This is on behalf of the Center for Development of Teaching and Learning, my great pleasure to present this book to Daphne.
My great pleasure.
With this, I thank everyone in this room for your participation and for listening to a very interesting invited lecture. And so I now close the session.